I want to welcome all of you here tonight to the Rosenmeier Forum, which features our Deputy Commissioner of the Pollution Control Agency, Mr. Peter Tester. Laura Radeke is going to be the person who introduces Mr. Tester because she made this event possible. And before I introduce Laura, I did want to mention to you that we here at Central Lakes College are very, very proud to be the administrator of the Rosenmeier Center for the Study of State and Local Government, honoring Gordon Rosenmeier, who, without question, is considered to be by all Minnesota historians as the greatest, the single most powerful, influential, and respected legislator in all of Minnesota history. One of the things that Gordon Rosenmeier did in his career, in 1967 session, he authored the creation of the Pollution Control Agency. It was typical of Gordon to have had the vision to do that. We were the first state in the nation to have a pollution control agency. And interestingly, President Nixon, when he issued on December 3rd, 1970, the executive order creating the Environmental Protection Agency, he did so after having read the Minnesota legislation that was authored and written by Gordon Rosenmeier. And Gordon wrote his own bills. He didn't have staff to write his bills. He was that good. And Nixon looked at the legislation, and it was Minnesota Congressman at that time, Clark McGregor, and Bill Frenzel, who brought to the attention of Mr. Nixon the Minnesota legislation. And when the president saw it, he said, this is what we can do. And if you look at the EPA legislation, it replicates Minnesota's legislation written by Gordon very, very well. I'm doing too much talking, but with no further ado, it's my distinct privilege and honor to introduce to you Laura Radeke, who will introduce our distinguished speaker.
Thank you, Steve. The Gordon Rosenmeier Center for State and Local Government has as its mission the education of our area's citizens on key issues that will affect all of us. Some of these issues right now are climate change and the pollution of Minnesota's air, soils, and water. Tonight, we are honored to present the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's Deputy Commissioner Peter Tester, who will inform us on the agency's decision-making process. And in so doing, they fulfill their own mission, which is, like ours, education, ensuring that all Minnesotans will have healthy air, sustainable soils, clean water, and a better climate. Please read the more complete bio in your programs of Deputy Commissioner Tester so that you will better appreciate the work of the agency as it enacts the wonderful acts that Steve just talked about of the late State Senator Gordon Rosenmeier, who created the very first pollution control agency in the United States in 1967. Following his presentation, which is titled Getting It Right for Minnesota, Mr. Tester will take questions from the audience. And now please join me in welcoming Minnesota Pollution Control Agency Deputy Commissioner Peter Tester.
Good evening, everyone. Are you able to hear me all right? Great. Well, thank you, Laura, for the introduction. Thank you, Steve. Thanks for inviting me here on behalf of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you a little bit about the mission of the agency and hear how we do work that engages with the public, that engages in public governance, and how we interact with folks. And I'm interested and hope you'll have lots of questions at the end on any topic, not only what I'm going to talk about in particular, which is the decision-making process, but I'm going to touch upon, some of the cases that have been in the news over the last couple of years that are quite controversial, whether they were talking about the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline, whether we're talking about the Huber-Cohasset. Anything is fair game, so please ask questions. It's a real privilege, to be able to engage with you and engage with an informed audience on the MPCA's existence because, as both Steve and Laura mentioned, Gordon Rosenmeier is the reason that this agency exists. The mission of the agency is one that he wholeheartedly believed in. We use this mission statement as the touchstone to all of the decisions that the agency makes. It is also founded within the statutes of the state of Minnesota, which have founded the agency. And he had an interest and a skill in government to make it more effective and better. And he had a real desire to try to improve the lives of citizens through the functioning of government. And I think that is one of the reasons his leadership in the area of environmental protection and water quality in particular, which is why Minnesota has one of the strongest environmental protection schemes in the entire nation. A lot of times we get referred to as the California of the Midwest, and they're referring to sort of the strong natural resource protection and public policy that the state of California has on the West Coast. Similarly, we're often referred to as the New York from the East Coast. And it really is just a testament to the work that people like Gordon Rosenmeier did early on in the environmental movement that has laid the framework for how the agency takes and makes decisions. And I was particularly struck by a statement that made by Gordon Rosenmeier directly on this point that was quoted by Stephen Dornfeld in the Minnesota History article that Laura sent me. Some of you may have seen it, and I think Stephen Dornfeld spoke to this group, if I'm not mistaken, a while ago. But this was the quote from Gordon Rosenmeier, quote, "Minnesota water pollution laws have been adequate, but administration has faltered. We hope this new independent agency will take up where the old failed," end quote. And the quote highlights two things for me. First, that laws are no good unless they're actually understood and enforced. The responsibility lies heavily and primarily with the state agencies like the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, to take those laws and implement them to protect human health and the environment every single day. And it is an onus on us to sort of seize that mantle and do the work that the state legislature has said we must do through the laws, and the state citizens have voted for us to come on. The second thing is that we have to accept, I think, and admit that sometimes we're not going to get it right. In fact, oftentimes we're going to get it wrong, or there are going to be changes that need to be made. And you have to have the humility to understand that there are a lot of great ideas out there, and the way things have happened in the past is not always the way that they're going to be successful in meeting the challenges of today. And so government has to accept that there are a lot of wonderful ideas and engagement across the whole state, and you have to be willing to approach new issues that have come up in different ways. You have to challenge the way that agencies have been working in the past and decisions have been made in the past and be open to that. And Gordon Rosenmeier, from what I have read about him and learned, he learned sort of this land ethic that's very similar to sort of Aldo Leopold and some of those who might have read the Sand Company Almanac and sort of historic conservationists by living on the land in Little Falls and Brainerd, where he was from. And I think that's that sense of having walked the land and been out there gave him a perspective of the importance of these things. And I think that's another message that he has laid for all of us, that for those of us that work in St. Paul for state government, we've got to get out and we've got to walk the land and see the prairies and canoe the lakes and rivers and streams. We've got to work to connect in with people in order to better understand the responsibility that we have to manage these natural resources and improve these laws. So I don't know what he would say today, Gordon Rosenmeier, if he took a look at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. It's 900 plus employees now. We have 6 offices across the state. We have laws and regulations that are over 400 pages. It's a very different agency than what was created in 1967 when he started, and state government has ballooned since then as well, of course. But it wouldn't surprise me if he said that there's a lot more that we should be doing and can be doing and that we have to be doing in order to protect the environment from a lot of the new threats and challenges that we face, as Laura mentioned, from climate change. We have forever chemicals called PFAS, which are threatening our lakes and streams and watersheds all over. And I couldn't agree more. We have to do better. You know, Minnesota is facing this trifecta right now of all of the branches of government being under the same political party. We've got Governor Walz as the governor of Minnesota. We have a House and Senate. And it's incumbent upon, you know, us who are in these roles to make significant progress in addressing human health and the environment. And we can't afford to miss this opportunity. And I think hopefully there'll be some questions about some of the priorities of the agency and of individuals coming up as well. So maybe to better understand how the agency makes decisions, it might help to know a little bit about, you know, here's what we do and who we are. This picture on the left is of the Rainy River back in 1967. It was a time when the companies had used our water bodies, you know, to dump toxic wastes and pollutions. Cities sent raw sewage directly into them. This is on the Canadian border. The picture on the right is the same river 50 years later after the Clean Water Act was passed and efforts were made across the state to improve water quality, habitat, and natural resources. And it was the tireless work of people up in that area and at state government that made this possible. And it's a great example of the successes that come from hard work and relying on science and data to make changes on the land, that we can improve the environment, we can make major improvements in people's health if we devote the resources and the energy, and this is only one example. Last year was the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, and so there were lots of celebrations, and this is just one example of what the Rainy River was and what it has become. 1967 was when Gordon Rosenmeier created the PCA. So, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is how do we make decisions? And the process that we make decisions sort of starts at the very beginning of that mission statement of protecting human health and the environment. And the legal authority for the agency to act mirrors that in the state statute. And the One Minnesota mission is an adage and an acronym that Governor Walz and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan have coined and asked all state agencies to try to direct all of their efforts to, depending upon their own particular mission, improving the lives for all Minnesotans across the state, in every geographic area, every socioeconomic field, of every ethnic background, that we need to do our work across the whole bit, and we need to collaborate and work together with folks. And in terms of Governor Walz's sort of approach, well, maybe before I get to that, some of the core issues of what the agency does, just so you have some idea of what we do. You know, we issue permits for discharges and land, air, water contaminants. We enforce regulations by bringing enforcement actions. We have a strong education and pollution prevention program where we're helping local businesses with grants and loans assistance to improve the output of their businesses and manufacturing units. We develop rules to protect the environment. It's a very regulated, bureaucratic agency. As you can see how many state laws we have. We have federal delegation, the work that we do under the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, the acronym of RCRA, are all delegated by the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and that agency has directed us to do certain things regarding these areas. And so when we make decisions, we start with our mission, we start with the law and the facts. And Governor Walz has really said that the decisions that he wants agencies to make have to be based and grounded first and foremost in data and in the science. And that's the sort of rubric that he has asked all of our decisions to begin with. And so given that we are an agency that is filled with scientists, about 70% of us, I'm not a scientist, I'm an environmental lawyer by background and training, but are filled with engineers and hydrologists and chemists and all these other disciplines that you see here. And And so it's not unusual for decisions to be grounded in science and data when that is the educational background and that is the perspective and sort of paradigm that all of our agencies look at different things. So following the science and the rules also has to take into account sort of where our work is happening, and the agency is divided up into 6 different regions. Right here in Brainerd, we have one of our offices. I wanted to point out Nicole Blazing is here. Nicole, can you raise your hand? She is the MPCA's regional manager in Brainerd. There are 6 of them. And part of this is a deliberate effort to try to have state government be out on the land and in the communities so that we can interact with folks and collaborate. And that's part of our decision-making philosophy, is that given the acts, what we're dealing with, the permits we're issuing, the businesses we're regulating, the money that we are bringing into communities for everything from electric vehicles and infrastructure to community grants for recycling and composting, we need to know what is happening in the individual parts of the state. And so our agency has got offices in 6 of these locales. There are 3 ways that we talk about addressing pollution, which is you can prevent it, you can manage it, you can clean it up. The old adage, pollution prevention pays, has been demonstrated to be accurate and paying off. Pollution, preventing it is the most effective, most efficient way of doing our job, and by leading with policies and guidance that prevent pollution, we can make a huge difference. And so that is the first rubric when we're trying to make decisions. Can we prevent pollution from happening, and how do we do that? The second way is you can manage pollution, right? We manage when prevention is not an option, when the pollution has already occurred and we have to do something about it, but that is a secondary consideration to prevention. And then the third part is to clean it up. And then, cleaning up when it can't be managed or prevented, it's by far and away the most expensive part of managing environmental issues. And by the time we're addressing pollution at this stage, the damage to the environment and the ecosystem, to human health, has already happened. And that's why we work to sort of front-load decision-making at the prevention stage. But given the number of permits and licenses and decisions that this agency has to deal with on an annual basis, which is over 20,000, the number of enforcement cases that we bring, formal actions against businesses, individuals for violations of permits and statutes, which is somewhere between 400 and 600 a year, it's absolutely essential that we have programs and policies and and processes in place to manage these, because it is just for efficiency, for consistency from one to another. There just isn't enough time for every single decision that has to be made to bubble up to the higher ups in the management. And so we spend a lot of time putting together programs and policies that individuals and managers and supervisors can execute. And so I just wanted to go through a few of them to get you some idea of where does the agency make decisions at a lower level? Where does it make decisions at a higher level? Where are some of the areas where we're missing paradigms and processes, and where we're having to create new things even now as we're grappling with issues that are cross-media, are very complex environmental issues. There's always oversight by managers and supervisors and decisions, but most of the decisions do not come up to the commissioner's office. In some cases, the processes and the decision-making have been approved by the commissioner's office itself, but most day-to-day decisions don't come to that level. They are dealt with by experts, subject matter experts in the field, whether it's in wastewater, whether it's in air, whether it's in water. And so examples for you. So, the meetings with a farmer on a feedlot application are happening by folks in the feedlot section who have experience in that. The work with a business on a permit for an air emissions permit, or for a large factory down in, say, Minnesota, the Minnesota River Valley is done by air engineers and permit engineers who are familiar with modeling and air dispersion, and they have standards and criteria by which they apply that. evaluating how monies that come into the state from things like the VW settlement, which was the big vehicle emissions tampering bucket of money, is done by people who are involved in the grant services, and we have criteria for putting grants out. Working with towns and cities to provide them with staff members in our Green Step Cities program and our Green Corps. Those are all done by folks without coming up to the commissioner's office, coming up to the top part of it. And so, but look, that's the normal routine work that happens in the agency. But there are some areas, in some cases, in some circumstances, where the normal process doesn't work. And it doesn't work because the issue could be new. We have this family of chemicals called PFAS. They're the Teflon that the 3M company and DuPont were using that are very viscous. They're very damaging to the environment and human health, and it's been in the last 10 years that those chemicals have really come to be seen as being detrimental to human health and the environment. You might have seen some of the newspaper articles on PFAS. You might have seen the movie Dark Waters, which takes place in Tennessee, I believe, where there was a plant there, but that was a recent book as well. And these new chemicals that we don't have a paradigm for how to handle is an issue that the agency has to grapple with. Another reason that is that the issue is contentious and political. So factory farms in the feedlot area, the big farms that are now being proposed, for example, up west of the White Earth Reservation by Riverview Dairy, where they're talking about 20,000 head of cattle in a feedlot, the largest feedlots that the state of Minnesota has ever seen. We have not had feedlots that large. The impact on water resources in an area of the state that's got a lot of demand for water, there's a drought up there, is a new paradigm for us to have to handle. Some of the more other political contentious issues are sulfide mining and the copper-nickel mining of the twin metals and the polymet that many of you are familiar with, and I think you have even had some discussions here on those topics. The Line 3 Enbridge oil pipeline. These issues involve complex water, air, and land issues, and a different approach is needed for that. And the MPCA uses several strategies for more complex decision-making. First, we get together a multimedia team of subject matter experts. It is usually led by someone in the commissioner's office, one of the assistant commissioners or myself. We meet on a regular basis every 2 weeks to understand what are the issues coming up. We try to set up this team months, if we can, half a year ahead of the actual decisions that we need to make so that we can understand. It's a heavy involvement of decision-making. The commissioner's office is involved because a lot of it is very political, and we need to keep the governor's office informed of what we're doing, key legislatures informed of what we're doing. We need to answer to the press requests that are coming in. And that's the fundamental decisions being made on the law and the science are the same, but the collective decision-making that has to manage that is done at a very high level. And the other area where we have to use a different decision-making is when the resource is unique. Obviously the Boundary Waters Canoe area is one of those. And so when the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and the Department of Natural Resources are looking at how impacts from mining and extraction industries, timber harvesting is having on the watershed in the Rainy Lake Rivershed Basin, which is what the Boundary Waters feeds into, those are very complicated issues that require a different decision-making. And we have an interagency team with the Department of Natural Resources, the Board of Soil and Water Resources, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and the Minnesota Pollution Agency that is looking at the impact on water quality from extraction within the Boundary Waters canoe area and within the Rainy Lake River watershed basis. Another strategy that we use on contentious and political is sometimes, honestly, to talk to the US EPA and to bring the federal government into the decision-making process. There are some decisions where the federal government has greater authority to both provide resources to assist managing and understanding what the resource impact is, as well as enforcement mechanisms. And so since what the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency does in air, land, and water is delegated down from the federal government retains the right to take over some of those issues. So there'll be contentious permits with certain industries that the U.S. EPA will want to take primacy on in the lead of an enforcement case, and we will do that. They may have resources in a particular area that we don't have subject matter experts, and they do, and so we will ask them to take over and either take the case entirely or work with us collectively. So when people talk about sort of the tension in decision-making at a political level, you know, there are a whole bunch of sort of trade-offs and tandems, we call them. And this is where agencies, and where the rubber hits the road and some of the science and the art comes in, where you've got this push and pull. And these are some of them. I'll just talk about two of them. One is the timeliness and due diligence up on the left circle. There are businesses and entities that want permits from the state of Minnesota. They're entitled to them. They want them very quickly because they're bringing new jobs, they're expanding, they want to take advantage of a particular opportunity that is only there for a short period of time, and so there's a desire to get these. At the same time, the countervailing tension is that some of these issues need the collection of data, the analysis of that data, the consideration of it over a longitudinal period of time, maybe months, maybe years, in order to understand what is the impact, therefore what can we put in the permits to allow them to do, or can we not allow them to have a permit at all, to discharge at all. It's simply too dangerous. And that tension is where the agency and where the commissioner's office and senior leaders like Nicole get involved in those discussions, because there's that tension that is always there. People and individuals want to run faster. We're a group of scientists. We like to ground ourselves in the science. And so there's due diligence. Another one where the tension is in the upper right, the environment and the economy. And sometimes people think that there is an inherent tension between these two, that always there's a zero-sum game. If the economy is going to prevail, the environment will suffer, and vice versa. And that is definitely not the case, but there's the need to balance. The need to balance the environment and the economy is found in state statutes, in some of the federal statutes, which expressly require us to consider the impact on the economy from our decision-making. The federal government has the very same requirement. So when the U.S. EPA is evaluating a permit or a rule, they have to take into consideration the impact on the community, the impact on the economy. Is the pollution control technology that we would like to impose on a wastewater treatment plant, for example, even technically feasible? Is it cost effective, and can they manage it? And so there's this tension at the same time that we have to protect human health and the environment. We have to balance that with economic considerations and wanting to promote. And you see that tension on, you know, the cases like the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline. You know, there was a lot of concern and disagreement about what was going to be the impact on the waters, the watershed and the water wetlands throughout the whole 300-plus miles of that pipeline. There was concern that the construction of it was going to result in degradation of some very sensitive wetland areas, fens, and even a calcareous fen. And so there was a lot of effort put in by the state agencies to try to provide as maximum protection as possible. And there was opposition within even the state agencies to the route that was established. Both the Minnesota Department of DNR and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency did not favor the route that the Line 3 pipeline went, very close to the Itasca State Park, the headwaters of the Mississippi. That decision, was made by the Public Utilities Commission, not by the governor, not by a state agency. And so once that decision was made, the state agencies had to work with the route itself. And at the same time, there were labor unions and communities along the pipeline that were very in favor of the pipeline itself. They thought it was necessary to bring jobs to the area. It was necessary for the long-term production of oil and plastics and everything that comes from refined petroleum. So that tension was there. The tension existed on the pipeline, as you saw in the newspapers, and if any of you were up on the pipeline itself, when there were lots of protests, and it was a very tense, very dangerous situation. And those are the types of sort of trade-off where environment and economy and public safety come to pass, and that's where the agency's leadership gets heavily involved. For the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline, we met regularly, almost weekly within the commissioner's office. We met every other week with the governor's office. We met with public safety folks. It was a very intense effort to try to understand the issues, to try to manage the issues, to try to work with communities, and at the same time provide access to everyone. So we would have meetings with project opponents, groups such as Honor the Earth and some Line 360 and others that were interested in a different route or a no route at all, and we would meet with them and talk with them, explain our process, explain the reasons for our decisions, and similarly we would meet with the pipe fitting unions and the labor unions up there and local communities, and that's part of that whole process of doing it. The other thing I wanted to say, I'm not quite sure where I am on time. Oh, I'm speaking way too much, but so I will speed up, was just, there are some areas of our laws and rules that we're trying to address now that we've never had to deal with before. Areas such as environmental justice, areas such as cumulative effects analysis to understand the cumulative impacts of a particular decision on a community, life cycle analysis of products, waste hierarchy, the public-private partnership. These are things that we have not had to deal with in the past as an agency in decision-making, and so our current decision-making protocols and processes really don't work for them, and we have to come up with new ways of managing those issues. And these new things, for me, having come into this role 4 years ago, kind of bump up against some of the sort of bureaucracy and the intransigence of sort of a bureaucratic state. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of, well, quote, this is the way we've always done things, or, you know, we can't do it that way, we've never done it that way. And so there has to be some new thought and new thinking about why aren't we able to do that right now? When Governor Walz came in, he wanted us to use the full scope of the resources and tools that the agency has in permitting and decision-making. And some of those hadn't been used for 10, 15 years. They were in statute. The legislature expected us to employ them, but for decisions that spanned all the way from resources and staff on one end to politics on the other, they weren't employed. And so we have taken some of those tools off the shelf and employed them. So some specific examples of that. We have in downtown Minneapolis, where the Northern Metals Recycling Company was, we have stopped and we prohibited production for a period of time until we just sort of ceased and shut them down until the pollution activities related to air emissions had been addressed. We pulled a permit from Water Gremlin. You might remember the Water Gremlin company makes lead sinkers down in White Bear Lake, Minnesota. They were accused of having allowed lead to be taken home by their workers that was then being ingested by young infants, and there were very high levels of lead poisoning levels, and the agency pulled the permits from Water Gremlin for a period of 6 months until they could work with the Minnesota Department of Health to resolve some of the health issues. And so, you know, those are some of the more extreme examples of authority that the state has had that it has not exercised in the past when human health, and they're more utilized when human health is directly involved and impaired, but they're the tools that we need to impose on cases like that. The last thing I'll say just about engagement and decision-making, this was a meeting about in December of this year. The woman on the left is the head of the US EPA's Region 5. That is the area that Minnesota sits in, the 6 states within Region 5, and we were meeting in North Minneapolis with community interest groups to understand what issues they were concerned about for a full day. And engagement and decision-making is really a hallmark of the Walz administration. Governor Walz and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, they want commissioners and deputy commissioners out talking to people, listening to people, understanding their concerns. We are on the road a lot precisely because of that. Their admonition to us is also, as I mentioned before, this One Minnesota, that we need to understand what are the local concerns so that we can do our job better and well. And the only way to do that is to listen. So on that front, I will stop talking and actually listen to you. I apologize for how long I was speaking, but I'm happy to take questions on anything.
You did beautifully. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
We could listen to more. Angela Schultz is our student member at the Rosenmeier Center. She's president of the Student Senate. She loves all things political and policy. And then Michael Rourke, board member. Before you go around, please ask Vermont any questions. Everybody, said I'm not going to shy away from anything, so ask questions.
First, okay.
I'm wondering if you can comment on, is this on? If you can comment on Talon's proposal to mine nickel at Tamarack.
Sure, yeah, the Talon deposit, which is over by Lake Mille Lacs, and right now it's at the preliminary stages of where the Talon Company has come to the state of Minnesota and expressed an interest in mining nickel in a large deposit that sits underneath sort of just north of Mille Lacs in that area. We are meeting with them to understand the scope of the project. It's at the very preliminary stages. They are seeking a huge grant from the federal government to do some analysis of impacts to water quality that would happen. My understanding is that some of the bands are in favor of the project, some of the bands are not. It's intended to be a closed mine, underground mine, so it's not one of the mines that would have its huge tailing basin that you would find similar to the taconite facilities, the ferrous mining up in the Iron Range. But it's in a unique area. It actually sits in an area that has high peatlands, and the state of Minnesota, I think it's fair to say the DNR is unsure exactly how the mining would affect peatland and peatland sort of ecology. And so there's some real concern about needing to get more information out of the federal government on that issue alone. And so you might have seen in the news, Tesla has entered into an arrangement with Talon to buy all of the nickel from that mine starting in 2026. There's no way the state will be able to go through environmental review and permit anything in that short period of time. So the expectations of Tesla are just unreasonable. You know, environmental review, which is the process of evaluating the impact of a project on lands, river, lakes, for a project like that will require an environmental impact statement. Those take years and years to do. You know, on the one hand, Talon, there is supposedly some very rich nickel deposits in that part of the state, but it's been untested as to how to withdraw that out of the ground, how to do it safely, and how to do it in an area with a unique ecosystem of peatlands right over there. So the federal government's work and some of the research that they've been doing will help inform that, but it's years away, even assuming they go forward with the project.
Well, they're buying property now.
Yeah.
We have friends that have sold their farms out to them. So, and could you comment on them processing the minerals in North Dakota, and who's going to oversee that?
Yeah, and that was one of the big changes. When Talon first came in, they were not going to be shipping and processing all the production in North Dakota, and it was as a result of several years' review of Minnesota's regulatory scheme for the environmental review and protection that we understand resulted in them deciding that they didn't want to have the production facility in Minnesota, that they were going to put it on trains and ship it to maybe an hour and a half west of the Minnesota border. That in and of itself, that process is going to have to go, they have to get, even if they could get the mineral, the nickel, out of the out of the ground, it has to come down to a rail spur that is crosses state land and public land and federal land, and so there'll have to be an environmental review for that. And that's the proposal that we've seen, is to truck it all, but that doesn't obviate the need to understand what is the actual mining going to do. They're going to have to be large storage on site, even though they're not going to be processing it there. They're talking about a lot of ore coming out of the ground, and so there's a big footprint. And they are buying up property rights and, surface mineral rights, underground mineral rights from landowners around the area. We're not involved in that, but I would assume a lot of those are contingent upon the project actually going forward, given that, no permits have been granted, no authorization has been provided, and it's still pretty speculative.
I have two questions. One dealt with a meteorologist coming to our church and saying that the bottom third of Minnesota lakes are so polluted that they can never return to any natural state again. Is that true?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer as to whether they can ever come back. I've never heard that. We have lists of water that are impaired for different parameters. It might be low in oxygen, it might be high in nitrogen, it might be high in sulfur. We have plans in place along with local governmental units like the Soil and Water Conservation Districts to bring those waters back into compliance with the standards. And we have in certain parts of the state an incredibly high number of impaired waters, down in the southwest part of the state and down even in the southeast part of the state. We have a high impairment of waters. We have honestly, a very slow track record of improving water quality and reducing those impairments and eliminating those impairments. It takes a lot of work on the land, best management practices, changing agricultural practices, reducing pollution, to eliminate the impacts that cause those waters to be impaired, that prevent people from swimming and fishing, and but I haven't heard that they'll never be able to come back. They are so polluted. Even the Minnesota River, which is heavily polluted with total suspended solids, is a dark chocolate-covered brown, and people wonder whether there's any fish in there, whether there's any aquatic life going on. The restoration of certain tributaries into it and of that area demonstrate that you can do this restoration with the right amount of effort and time and money. And a lot of work is going on right now by the Board of Soil and Water Resources, the state of Minnesota, to try to do things to manage and improve water quality in a huge way, to hold water on the land and try to keep it from polluting to begin with, and trying to collect agricultural stormwater runoff, the tile drainage, which is heavy in nitrogen, up on the land and in areas before it gets into the Minnesota River. So there are a number of demonstration projects all across the agricultural community on just water quality and water improvement. And on top of that, then there are all kinds of best management practices, from the use of cover crops and the use of different agricultural activities of no-till and ridge-till and things to reduce pollution and reduce soil erosion that's intended to improve water quality. But we are able, with this past every 2 years, the state of Minnesota has to list the impaired waters with the federal government. And I think this past round that happened in 2022, we were able to take a relatively small number out, granted, but somewhere, Michelle or Nicole, you might know the exact number, but I want to say somewhere around between 20 and 60 rivers and lakes were taken off the impaired waters list because the water quality had improved to the point where the impairment was gone. So it's possible, but in certain areas it takes a Herculean amount of effort and time.
And just one more question. I have a concern about, in the United States, we have people looking after the land. And the materials that we'll need for all these batteries, for electric vehicles and so forth, we need that. But we don't want it to happen in our area So we send it off to poor countries who have no laws or anything to protect, and they are asked to produce those minerals. And I'm just wondering, from a human standpoint, how can that be made more fair?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. You know, the way it plays out in Minnesota in many respects, particularly with, you know, the use of, when people are looking at copper nickel mining in the area outside of the boundary waters, but very close, and in those areas, the way a lot of people look at it is that there's a recognition that these minerals are needed, and they're going to be needed for the economy of the future. And the question is, where are you going to get them from? And are there some areas that are so pristine, so important, or that go to the core fabric of a particular region that we just cannot risk affording it? That is the way that people talk about the Boundary Waters Canoe area and the Rainy River watershed, that they're not, that is an area that is so pristine, is unique, is in a condition of incredible beauty and ecological purity that they don't want to. I'm just saying that's other areas. The same argument is made of the Grand Canyon and a lot of work that goes around right by the Grand Canyon, that these are iconic places. So there's that answer, which is like there's some areas that ought to be off limits. That's the argument, that they should be off limits because of the other attributes that they bring to society. And then the issue about need, you know, we're going to need these minerals someplace, and ought we to have them, you know, properly and sustainably mined and developed in countries, or do we turn to third world countries where the environmental laws are not as developed, even if they exist, such as in China, they are not enforced, and the degradation that goes on as they're mining them is really atrocious, you know, and the pollution that happens as they're mining in places of Western China is really tragic. And I don't have an answer for you. I can speak personally. So this is my personal opinion. I do think that there are those areas of the world that we ought not to be mining in, and we ought not to be developing, that they're so pristine, they're so unique, we will never get them back. And then there are other areas where we can responsibly extract resources from in a way that is environmentally less damaging. And we have to be willing to make that trade-off, or we're never going to be able to make the transfer to, you know, a carbon-free and economy to the degree we want to.
Thank you, Peter. Back in 2007, EPA initiated the first national lakes assessment, and it was implemented through state agencies, including Pollution Control Agency, and I think a tip of the hat to Minnesota. You were very, very consistent with your mission about collaborating. So there was great participation, coordinated by PCA with experts from DNR, Department of Agriculture, Department of Health, and conducting these samples of lakes to try and understand these, just a snapshot across the nation of what the health of our lakes are like. One of the sobering findings of that first lake assessment was the amount of detectable agricultural chemicals in headwater wilderness lakes, in the boundary waters, where there's no direct and obvious way for these chemicals to be in there, other than to assume that they were transported on soils by wind, soil erosion by wind, deposited far away. And as we think about the projections for climate change, we're going to probably be seeing more drought events, more of these kinds of situations where dry soils will be picked up by winds and transported, and we're using a lot of chemicals in our agriculture or other applications. So my question to you is as you think about your mission statement and how you would collaborate on problem solving some of these issues in a future warm climate and the things that we're experiencing now, how do you get your policy head on around how to grapple with these long distance transport issues, whether they're within the state or they cross borders of the state or they cross international borders? How does PCA fit into that? Where do you see the opportunities, things of that nature? Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's a great, sophisticated question. That's beyond my capacity to answer really intelligently. I'll give it a whirl. I mean, part of the part of the way environmental regulation and activism works is on a local level. And so the steps that we take in Minnesota, the pilot programs that we institute or take a look at for things that will prevent or reduce soil erosion, for example, that will reduce the amount of air deposition off of those lands, are things that can be replicated in other states. We belong to an organization called the Environmental Council of the States. It's the EPA for all the 50 states. We meet 4 times a year at the commissioner level, and we have regular meetings where we're sharing best practices by other states. So part of it is just educating everyone about what's working, because that problem of air deposition, whether you're talking about nitrates or you're talking about mercury from coal-fired power plants and other areas ending up in Minnesota's lakes, or you're talking about the nitrogen and some of the other nitrates that are coming in, is a global phenomenon. We need to be able to show that we can make a change at a very local, micro level, and that can be replicated across the state, it can be replicated across the United States, and it has to be replicated internationally. We spend, Katrina Kessler, the current commissioner, spends a lot of time in Washington, D.C., working on sort of national environmental protection strategies with other states that are interested in doing that on things like PFAS, the hypoxia task force that deals with nitrate pollution in the Mississippi River all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico and is causing the hypoxic zone there. Similarly, the hypoxic zone up in Lake Winnipeg from the same pollution that's coming out of the Red River of the north. And so there are ways that you have to support national and international efforts to reduce pollution, right? I mean, anyways, those are my off-the-cuff thoughts, but there is a definite need to take control of what you can, to do what you can here, to demonstrate its efficacy, and then try to convince others that it's a worthwhile effort, that in the long run, the environment, humans will be far better off by having a natural resource sort of management plan that is holistic, that is sustainable, and that can live together with a vibrant green economy in a way. And I think, one of the things I often preach about, and I was talking to Laura about this at dinner, was just the need for private-public partnerships. We are not going to regulate ourselves out of pollution in the state of Minnesota or in the United States. There just is not enough money. There is not enough people to regulate. We need to have a lot of work with public-private partnerships on the need for reducing pollution, for preventing it, for managing it, rather than cleaning it up. And in the agricultural field, you're seeing a lot more effort now in that area. Most of you probably know that agricultural runoff is not regulated by the Clean Water Act, and so the discharges from tile lines across fields are not regulated like a wastewater treatment plant or a company who's discharging into the river. And so there have to be other strategies, and there are, to address what they call non-point source solution, not coming out of a pipe. And that requires a lot of work with agricultural groups, with communities, at a public-private partnership, and you're seeing a groundswell of that in the United States. You're seeing some really creative work done here in Minnesota, in the Brainerd area, or actually in the St. Cloud area, with the Nature Conservancy, working with agricultural groups and with the State Department of Agriculture on innovative ways of keeping water on the land, of reducing pollution, and they're working with local farmers to try to build that. And I think the public-private partnership for environmental protection is an area where we need to spend a lot more time. At the agency, it's one of the things that I preach all the time, pollution prevention. If we could put as much money that the legislature gives us for cleaning up contaminated sites, for Superfund sites, into pollution prevention, into sustainability, into product stewardship, to remove chemicals, toxic chemicals out of the waste stream and out of the commerce, it would, in 10 years, it would save an incredible amount of land. We would have healthier air. There are really things that we can do if we were to reprioritize, and at the legislature, we're making some of those demands even now in bills that are in front of the environmental committees, that we ought to be restructuring the way we deal with environmental and sustainable protection, away from the command and control and cleanup and prevention, and more on the upstream life cycle analysis side of things to get at it.
My question for you deals with global warming, and I'd like to know what your personal prediction is for that 30 years to 50 years from now?
Well, my prediction is you wouldn't want to go to Las Vegas with the way I predict. So, I think in 30 years the environment in Minnesota is going to look pretty different than it. I can't tell you 50 years, but you are already seeing in Minnesota we have the second most severe weather changes in all of the United States outside of California. When you take a look at drought, you take a look at fire, you take a look at tornadoes, you take a look at flooding. So that in itself is just having an impact on the land, right? That's having an immediate impact on the land. At the same time, we're seeing more invasive species in the agricultural sector moving up north as the climate is warming. We are getting pesticides and bugs moving up from the central part of the state, from the United States, that we have never seen before. Research is going on at the University of Minnesota on soybean rust and some of the other sort of invasive exotic bugs that are coming in and attacking croplands that heretofore had not been able to sustain themselves in Minnesota because it was too cold, and you're seeing that migrate north, right? You're seeing the whole forest patterns change in the state of Minnesota as species that are warm weather and drought tolerant are having more of an impact moving north, and some of the coniferous forests of the Northeast, and those are migrating north. And you're going to see a change on the land in 30 years, right? You are going to see stands of pine and jack pine and white pine and tamarack that aren't going to be where they are today when you drive up north. So we're going to see that. I think that change within 30 years easily, that we are going to see changes on the landscape.
Are you working with natives and Ojibwe to enhance their environment too?
Yeah, great question. Great question. We, Governor Walz and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, you might know she's a member of the White Earth Nation, have made a strong commitment to work with the 11 native tribes in Minnesota, the Ojibwe and the Dakota, to understand the natural resources within their reservations, to understand the ecological perspective that tribes bring to issues. At a very granular level, the governor has required every state agency to meet annually with each of the 11 state tribes. So we have 27 cabinet agencies in state government. We meet with those tribes at least once a year in formal consultation. We go up to the reservations, we meet for the day and talk to them about issues. We talk with them at a lower level within the agency all the time. Tribal engagement and tribal natural resource managers are very involved in decision making that the state is making right now. We're using it because some of those tribes now have the ability to regulate activity on their land, and under the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, it's called treatment as a state. So the tribes, because of their sovereignty, are able to take over the management of certain provisions under the Clean Water Act themselves, and so we need to work with them as sort of co-equal entities. They are, in many cases where they have that status, they are no different than if we were dealing with the state of Wisconsin or the state of South Dakota. When we have border issues with the state of Wisconsin along the St. Croix River, we have to manage it collectively. Similarly, for those states that have those tribes that have treatment as a state under the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, we need to work with them. The other thing is that some of the tribes have a very robust, sophisticated natural resource department. Leech Lake Reservation has over 60 professionals in their natural resources department. Now that's equivalent of DNR and the PCA, but they are incredibly talented. They have done longitudinal research on the natural resources within the Leech Lake Reservation for decades. Our ability to interact with them and to work with them on everything from wild rice beds to timber harvest in that area is really essential. And so that's a great question. The other part that's really interesting is that in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a whole new acceptance of traditional ecological knowledge, native ecological knowledge. How do the Native Americans interact with the land? How are they envisioning natural resources, and trying to take that, they call it TEK, tribal ecological knowledge, into resource decision-making. The federal government, the US EPA, the Department of the Interior, is actually utilizing some of that native indigenous information in development of management plans. The Apostle Islands Management Plan of Bayfield in Wisconsin has a brand new program by the National Park Service where they're managing the 22, 23 islands of the Apostle Islands based upon a management plan that was developed by the Red Cliff Band and by GLFWC, which is the Great Lakes Fish and Indian Wildlife Commission group, utilizing that traditional native knowledge. So wherever we can partner with entities, whether that's tribal governments or local groups or nonprofits or chambers of commerce that have relevant information, we need to take advantage of it. And that tribal perspective is unique. And it's bearing fruit in certain areas. Great question.
Peter, I am getting really old and I'm half deaf. And I've noticed that if the mic is held close, the sound picks up much better. They're very sensitive to distance. So I'm holding it close, and I'm concerned about the boundary waters, which I think is unique in really probably all the world, that there's an area up there in Minnesota extending up into Canada that is a worldwide treasure. And I read the paper, but I'm wondering, I'd like to hear from you where the protection is and what you think is the hope that that whole environment can be protected.
Yeah, well, Jerry, a great question. Right now, the DNR is, there are a couple things that I could talk. I mean, personally, and even on behalf of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, I can tell you that there is great concern for preserving the water quality, the air quality, the natural resources within the Boundary Waters Canoe area and within the Rainy River watershed, which feeds that. That we know, we have done studies on water quality in that part of the state, and it is absolutely pristine relative to everywhere else. And we know that any type of impact in the watershed is going to adversely affect water quality. Now that has to be balanced between, there are people living in the watershed, there are businesses, there are towns, there's industry already there. You saw the picture of the Rainy River up by International Falls in 1967, Boise Cascade, now PCA is still there. There's lots of impact. But I do know there is a recognition about state government natural resource managers that that area deserves special attention. So some of the things that are happening right now, the Department of Natural Resources, right now there's a boundary around the BWCA of about a half mile, I think. CBU may know the answer to this one. But anyways, there's a corridor around the boundary waters where there can be no extraction mining because the thought was any activity in that would flow in. And the Department of Natural Resources is doing an analysis as to whether that whole area of protection needs to be expanded. That decision is supposed to come out, I think, this summer. And the decision may be that they have to open up and reevaluate. One option for them is to open up and reevaluate and say, how much of a protection do we need for the watershed, for the boundary waters? Do we need a much larger protected area, not just the half mile that currently exists under state law, but the whole watershed to be protected in order? That's one effort that's underway right now. The 20-year mining moratorium that you saw in the newspaper by the U.S. Department of the Interior, it was also based upon, the analysis that the federal government needed to look seriously at mining and timber areas within the boundary waters because it was, as currently conducted, was adversely affecting it. I'll talk personally. Personally, I think it ought to be protected, the whole watershed area. I think, with the exception for existing businesses and things that are going on, it's one of those pristine areas. I'll be totally honest. My hobbies are outside. I love to hunt, I love to fish. I'm going on a 50-day canoe trip up into the Arctic next summer with friends that I've wanted to do forever, up into Hudson Bay and that area. I live and work in these lands. I appreciate them. I also am a public servant, and I appreciate sort of, the needs to balance the economy and the environment, but I think the area of the boundary waters is just too unique to not be have the highest protections possible. I think those protections are not adequate under the current regime. I think that's partly why the Department of Natural Resources is reevaluating what more do we need to do. You know, we like to tout in Minnesota that we have really strong environmental laws, and we do relative to other states, but that doesn't mean that they're protective enough given the situation right now. I think there's a desire by many that we need to reopen and reevaluate some of our environmental protection strategies and laws so that they can be more protective.
So Peter, two things. The Biden administration has just put a 20-year moratorium on further development within around the Boundary Waters canoe area in regard to mining. And then also in Minnesota, there's a movement to, it's called a Prove It First bill. It's a Prove It First that the argument is often made that, well, we let sulfide mining go on all around the world and it desecrates land everywhere. And in fact, there's not one single example of a sulfide mine that hasn't done damage. So this Prove It First bill wants to say, okay, if you prove you can do it safely somewhere else, then we may listen to you. What are your thoughts on that bill, or even Betty McCollum, Representative Betty McCollum in the Congress, wanting to make a legislation in regard to protecting the Boundary Waters canoe area, which would then, a presidential decision that's been made, it would be stronger than that.
Yeah. Well, the Prove It First, I mean, we have an example of that. Environmental regulation in Europe is based just upon that, Prove It First. So you have to demonstrate, for example, in Europe, that the chemicals that you are going to be discharging are not going to be doing any harm to the biota or to the human health before, and you have to prove it scientifically in front of their equivalent of the FDA and the US EPA. So in the United States, we have a very different regime of environmental regulation. The toxic chemicals under the Toxic Chemical Substance Act, TSCA is the acronym of it, is a list of about 80,000 chemicals that the United States has decided you don't have to determine, you know, they were in the stream of commerce by the 1980s. There was no efficacy and data done on them before, and so they've been allowed to remain, notwithstanding the fact that we don't know the impact of a lot of these chemicals. Why do you think we have the problems with PFAS and all of that? Because these chemicals were in existence in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and 70s before there was any demand by the federal government on proving the safety and efficacy of chemicals on the environment and human health. You know, now today in the United States, new chemicals have to undergo that. But in Europe, they have essentially Prove It First, and they've had it for a while. I think there's a lot of merit to that. I mean, if you can't demonstrate, you know, that the products that you're making are going to be safe, they're going to be safe to humans and safe to the environment. You know, I worked for Ecolab for 12 years. Ecolab is a chemical company. You guys might think of it as a soap company. It does make soaps, but it also makes antimicrobials. It's based out of St. Paul with 170 plants around the world. And Ecolab is taking the position that, you know, as a company, they need to prove it first, right? They need to be sustainable. They need to have a business model that allows them to demonstrate the efficacy and the safety of new chemicals that they're bringing out before they get registered with all of the states and all of the countries. They have found that they can do business that way, and I think that's kind of the approach that we need to take. That we need to take that approach. It's very similar, like the adage of pollution prevention pays, right? Don't do damage. I mean, if you're unclear as to whether your activity is going to do damage, personally, I don't think we should be permitting it, or we should be encouraging other ways to get around it, or we ought to be incentivizing people to be doing things the correct way, the environmentally friendly way. There's a lot of effort with this public-private partnership that I talked about, is trying to incentivize the right environmental action by entities and companies. So the federal government, the state government, we give hundreds of billions of dollars in grants and subsidies and tax breaks to all kinds of individuals and businesses for activities. And we ought to couple a lot of that money with doing things, I think, in a sustainable way, in a way that is protective of human health and the environment, and that can still generate business, can have strong economies, and value. And there are efforts at trying to meld those two instead of just throwing money at a company for a certain thing. Provide grants, provide loans, provide experience, provide financial assistance, provide education, but get something back on behalf of the citizens of the state of Minnesota when we're giving out the money, for the country when the federal government gives out that money. I think that's an entirely plausible and reasonable exchange. Yes.
Do you know anything about the cleanup process or how long it's going to take for the St. Regis Superfund site?
The St. Regis Superfund site?
Yeah.
That's a site in Cass Lake. For some of you who might know, it was the Champion Regis Paper Mill. It was a paper company, and it's a federal Superfund site that is managed by the US EPA. Parts of the cleanup have already happened. I think it's going to be decades, I think they believe, before all of the cleanup of the pollution on the ground and in the lakes that are right to the east of the St. Regis site are all cleaned up. But right now there's efforts to redevelop some of that property by the band and by the state of Minnesota. Parts of it have been cleaned up and are safe for utilization for businesses. They're also trying to clean up some more for housing developments. And the band is interested in acquiring some of that land for their purposes as well. But it's going to take a long time. It's decades from now. Tens of millions have already been spent in cleaning it up, and it is decades away with another, I think, $30 to $40 million of cleanup. It's just extraordinary. Once we've done pollution, trying to clean it up. And we're not trying to clean it up. Unfortunately, it's not going to go back to a pristine nature. It's going to go back to a condition where it can be used for industry or residential, but a lot of that pollution is never cleaned up. And that's really sad, but there's a lot of effort up there. And that's a classic case of where the bands have one idea of what they want that land to look like. They have historically hunted and fished and gathered the wild rice, blueberries on that property. And in many parts of right by St. Regis and Cass Lake, they're never going to be able to do that, right? The land is not going to be utilized for harvesting and for hunting and fishing because it's so polluted. And it's very tragic.
Thank you. I'm wondering, we used to hear a lot about the environmental superfund, and is it really super? And what's the relationship of the environmental agency to gaming?
To gaming? Yes. Like gambling gaming, or? Yeah. So the Superfund, which is the sort of moniker for the federal law that is responsible for funding cleanup of contaminated sites from pollution, is woefully underfunded. The demands on it, even within the state of Minnesota, far outstrip what were provided. The US EPA constantly goes to the federal government seeking additional funding. It's in the tens of billions to clean these up. And they're just not having the federal government, the Senate and the House appropriate sufficient money for that. So in Minnesota, we have an analog called MIRLA, the Minnesota Environmental Rights and Liability Act, which also funds some of that, but it too doesn't have nearly the funds to clean up the pollution within the state of Minnesota that is there. We have major cleanup typically requires major federal dollars. So the St. Louis River area of concern, which is in the estuary, the St. Louis River up from Duluth all the way up, has a number of contaminated sites from historic industry that's up there, and that has required the federal government to put in hundreds of millions of dollars to clean up all of the pollution in the Great Lakes. It's that level that is needed, to address. Laura, you were mentioning Betty McCollum. She has a very ambitious bill similar to the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative for the whole Mississippi River Basin all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico to try to have Congress allocate money for all of the 10 states that sit within the Mississippi River Basin for a massive cleanup of that proportion. So instead of spending, you know, 5-10 million in each state, it's going to really transform the way agricultural practices are happening in that area, how holding water on the land and pollution and cleanup of water is taking place. But those are the type of major efforts. We have had them in the Everglades, for example. The cleanup of the Everglades has similarly been a huge federal effort. Chesapeake Bay, Puget Sound, and the Great Lakes are the 4 instances where the federal government has come in and done massive restoration and cleanup in a way that has actually changed the water quality on the land, has changed the air in those regions. And that's the kind of effort that is needed within the Mississippi River, and it's needed in some areas in California and other places. But it just is an incredibly expensive proposition to do that.
Could you elaborate on the governor's expectation that state agencies make their decisions based on data?
Yeah. I can tell you from being in direct meetings with him on controversial projects, he wants to see the science, see the data. So if we're making the decision, for example, what that means to him is that if we don't have the science and the data, then we have to go out and get it. And he has to be willing to step up and make funds available and resources available to do that. And he has understood that. If he is going to make that as a moniker and a line in the sand that he wants to make decisions based on the science and the science doesn't exist, he has to provide the wherewithal for us to get it and advocate at the legislature for that. So, and he's been willing to do that. The budget requests of the agency, given the huge state surplus that we're seeing right now, reflect a massive infusion to all of the agencies for a lot of scientific data collection in order to do that. At the same time, there are areas of environmental protection where the science has just not caught up with the problem. We don't have detection limits and detection methodologies to understand what is in certain chemicals right now. So we don't have the analytical chemical protocols of how to analyze this glob of pollution. They don't exist. They don't exist anywhere. And so there are areas where the science is developing to come up with analytical methods for testing certain pollution that just don't, and in those instances where the state agency has to make a decision based on the best available science, that's what we would defer back to, right? The science doesn't exist, so what's our best available science, or what's an analogous situation that we can take from? Because we can't sample. We just don't have the chemical testing methods for these. You can ask somebody like 3M, for example, for PFAS. There's over 5,000 chemicals in the PFAS family. That's the Teflon family. I think there are analytical methods for analyzing for only 200. So that means, we don't even know how to test for the presence of that, much less understand at what concentrations those pose a risk to vulnerable individuals, whether that's the elderly, whether that's the youth, whether it's pregnant mothers, whether it's, whatever. And so in those situations, we take what data we have and try to make the best judgment. Sometimes we've spoken about, well, where we don't have the information, can we even make a call? Maybe we can't do it, right? The issue is so sensitive that we really have to wait for the science to catch up. And in the meantime, we're just not going to be able to permit that activity or allow that discharge, that it's too dangerous because we don't know the consequences to it. But it's a real dilemma when the analytical science has not caught up with the problem. And that doesn't just happen with PFAS. There are other areas as well where we don't have enough information. We don't have enough information about air pollution in certain areas, for certain communities that have been disadvantaged even in Minneapolis itself, which has a pretty strong and robust air monitoring network. If an individual in a certain part of the city wants to know, well, can I develop a new manufacturing process with discharging certain air pollutants? What impact will that have on the community, the overall impact on that community? We don't have the monitoring data to know, and we don't have the modeling data to know what is the impact of that particular industry on this particular neighborhood that has been historically disadvantaged. You know, that data doesn't exist. And so that's where those are really tough cases, because we don't have the science. You know, we know that there's an impact, but we can't quantify the impact either qualitatively or quantitatively. We just, and then we make judgments, like I said, based on analogies, past practice, and evaluation, and ultimately a decision that we hope is upheld, that's reasonable, that's practical, that's protective of human health and the environment. And you know, you might think, God, Peter, he keeps talking about protecting human health and the environment, but I can't tell you how often that is what we fall back on. Like, okay, if it's not going to be protective of human health and the environment, the starting point has to be we shouldn't do it. If we're going to deviate from that, there must be an overwhelming reason to do that, right? It must be critical for individuals or industry or the state. There may be exceptions to that. There may be ways that we can't mitigate it right now, but we know that we're going to be able to mitigate that harm or that impact in a year or 2 or 3 years or 4 years, and we're willing to take the risk that we will be successful in mitigating it to allow that right now. But those are tough, really tough situations, and they happen more often than you would imagine. You know, people want guarantees that they're, you know, they want a guarantee that when, you know, the agency and the DNR issued the permits for the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline, that the installation of that pipeline wasn't going to cause any problems, and it did. You know, there have been aquifer breaches on at least 4 sites along the line that have been in the news. Some of those were inadvertent, some of those were done inappropriately, but there was no guarantee, you know, that there wasn't going to be environmental harm from a project that big. You know, the agencies did their best to prevent it, to minimize it, but no one could ever say that constructing a 350-mile pipeline through some of the most sensitive wetlands and water areas of the state of Minnesota might not result in breaches of the environmental laws, and they happened. And those guarantees are just, you know, those absolutes are rare, you know. I mean, to go back to, Jerry, what you were saying, in some areas, at least personally, I can say for the boundary waters, I'm prepared to have an absolutist sort of position. That's me personally, right? But it's very hard to, you know, mistakes are going to be made, human error will occur, unexpected situations. The Line 3 pipeline, there was incredible geology and soil borings that were done all across the whole 350-mile line of the pipeline. And yet, when they actually got in to these particular areas where they had done soil borings and corings to understand the hydrogeology that when they put the pipeline in was going to adversely affect, there were still consequences that, you know, really competent, vetted, peer-reviewed science, it didn't work, you know. It wasn't enough in retrospect, you know, and some can say shame on us for allowing that. Maybe we should have been more vigilant. We probably, you know, in retrospect, yeah, we should have been more vigilant. We should have been more protective. You know, you can't look at what happened and say, oh, well, that's okay. That's the risk the government runs. We need to do our job better. We need to do better science, and we need to be more protective so that doesn't happen again, because those, we can do a better job. We have to do a better job.
Deputy Commissioner, as your agency deals with industries such as farming, mining, and logging, how much of your time or the staff time is spent in an adversarial role, and how much as collaborators trying to find solutions?
Oh, I would, don't hold me to these numbers, but you can quote them anyways. I think about 75% is collaborative and working together. Probably 25% is adversarial and enforcement. Okay. And that comes from spending a lot of time trying to understand the project, the impacts of the project, working back and forth, getting input from concerned citizens and others. And yeah, I might even say 80% is much more of a cooperative. It doesn't mean we're cooperating to get the project done, but it's not adversarial. It's not ending up in court. It's not ending up in an administrative process.
Is there any, we probably have time for maybe one more question before we wrap it up. We've
What issue are you most passionate about in your job right now?
It's honestly trying to work on nutrient reduction and tackling the pollution from agricultural practices. My family, half of my family grew up in southern Minnesota in a town called Gibbon, which is just north of New Ulm. I have plenty of cousins who are farmers and are working on this. You know, and I think the opportunity to address the impact of agricultural pollution on our waterways and land is necessary. It's really exciting. It's an area where that public-private partnership has to happen. And there's a lot of creative work going on to develop new crops, new crops that can be grown on the land year-round that will prevent soil erosion. So it's a very creative area. And it's incredibly important given that we currently don't regulate it. So it's an area where we need it. It's calling out for more laws and more regulations, as much as I can say that, given that we have 400 pages of laws and regulations. Some people will go, but we need to find a better balance, and it can make a huge difference. So that's the area that I think has got a lot of potential.
Thank you very much for your time, for coming up to Brainerd. We appreciated this.
Thanks very much.